I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Welcome to another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. This month we're honored to have on Charles Coulombe, who is a historian, writer, lecturer, and storyteller who's covered topics ranging from the history of the papacy, traditionalism, haunted houses, rum, and the history and political theory of monarchism. Today he joins us to speak of the socio-political ferment out of which came the Catholic worker movement and what lessons we can learn from it today. So, take it away.
Well, there's an awful lot to be said, really. One almost doesn't know where to begin. But I guess the important thing to bear in mind, first and foremost, is that the Catholic social teaching, and with it, you might say European conservatism, really comes out of the reaction of the French Revolution. That's actually where you have to begin to see it. Because in response to the French Revolution, people like Novalis in Germany and de Bonal and de Maistre in France and other people elsewhere, they began to wonder, how did things go so horribly wrong? How is a society that was seemingly stable turned into bloodshed? And how did it go on for so long? So how do you A, explain it, and B, try to ensure that it never happens again? Well, several things came out of that. One of them was the idea that the proximate cause of the problem was the Enlightenment. The age of reason turned on its head, reason taken to its extreme becoming unreasonable. But again, where did that come from? Well, it came, they would say, ultimately from the Protestant revolt and the breakdown of what today we would call the medieval synthesis of church and state, of the position of the faith in everyday life, and so on. So that's what they would have traced it back to. Okay, well, where do we go from here? Because in addition to the revolutions having broken up the furniture, and it's very hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, you have another element joining the mix, and that's the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly, in many major cities across Europe and in America and elsewhere, you have these urban mobs living miserable lives, working in horrible factories. And what do you do about that? Well, what people of the sort I've been describing, and then later on, church thinkers like von Kettler in Germany and Vogelsang here in Austria, de la Tour du Pin in France, and on and on and on. Lots of these people. They basically came up with the idea that what you needed to do was somehow restore the essence of the medieval synthesis in the modern day. In other words, and I'm oversimplifying wildly, just so you know, but a factory owner should be as paternal to his employees as a medieval landowner was to his tenants. That kind of relationship was what they saw as being restored. Now, how you do that was expressed in a number of different ways. And ultimately, they were kind of summarized by Leo XIII in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, which is a huge watershed in the development of Catholic social teaching. Well, bear in mind, though, that in Leo's day, you still had an awful lot left of the old Catholic order in the life of Europe, and even in America. In America, of course, we weren't a Catholic country, though we had Catholics. But what we had inherited from the Catholic past was a moral consensus. The different kinds of Protestants, Catholics, Jews, all more or less agreed that the same things were right and wrong. And that moral consensus was one of the last inheritances from the before time, for want of a better word. Okay. Then comes World War I. World War I wipes away most of what's left of the old order in Europe, including the inimitable and much lamented Blessed Karl of Austria, who sort of epitomized, both in his attention to social teaching and everything else, he sort of epitomized what generations would have seen as the ideal Catholic monarch. The fact that he was a victim of the whole thing himself is sort of symbolic of what happened to Europe. All right. Now you have the interwar years, and something really interesting is happening. For one thing, with the destruction of the last remnants of that old order in Europe and in America, the attempt for Catholics to find their place, because now, by this time, we finally had numbers. Now, I have to say, and it's not one of our better chapters in Catholic American history, we were never big on evangelization. But we had sort of a gentleman's agreement, you might say, that in return for respectability, and maybe one day one of our own being president, we wouldn't rock the boat too much. But we did have immigrants, and boy, did they come over. And they had kids. So before you knew it, despite our best efforts, we were a power in the land. After World War I, when the church in Europe was so impoverished, the church in America, which already had some odd ideas, Leo XIII condemned Americanism and that kind of thing. Nevertheless, in 1928, Cardinal Mundelein of Chicago, one American archbishop, bailed out the Holy See. The Holy See was on the verge of bankruptcy, and a single American archdiocese retired the debt. Well, one of the things you find in periods of disorder, like the period after the First War, the period after Napoleonic Wars, and so forth, is that up until the 60s, when for other reasons it didn't happen, you would usually get waves of converts to Catholicism, people looking for truth in large numbers. And a lot of these inevitably were intellectuals, writers, and so on. In America, after the First War, we did not have a great many native-born Catholic American thinkers, cradle Catholic American thinkers. But what we did have were a number of foreigners who thought about the church's social teaching and a number of converts. And after World War II, I keep saying that, World War I, please believe me, after World War I, and then especially with the arrival of the Great Depression, people of that sort began to put their thoughts to how does the church deal in America with this new situation. In Europe, They tried a lot of different ways, actually, in Austria, Lithuania, Portugal, Spain, different places. But all of them traced their interests and their basic ideology to another papal encyclical, which is extremely important to read, Quadragesimo Anno of Pius XI. 40 years after, meaning 40 years after Rerum Novarum of Leo XIII. Okay, now we'll go back a little bit. We've hit the Depression. We're going to go back once again to the immediate post-war era. You had converts, as I say, and ethnic Catholics in America talking about the Church's social teaching. It was only after the First War when American Catholics played a big part in the American war effort. For instance, our United States Conference of Catholic Bishops owes its origin to what was called the National Catholic War Council. And what that was an umbrella organization of various Catholic groups to assist the government in fighting the Great War in 1917 and 18. Well, when the war was over, there was a lot of post-war dislocation. There were certain immediate economic issues. And so in 1919, the American bishops commissioned Monsignor John Ryan of Minnesota to write the bishop's program for social reconstruction. It's well worth reading. And it is the first, I think, serious attempt to apply Catholic social teaching to the American scene. All right, well, what happens, though, is the boom of the 1920s. People really aren't that interested in social reconstruction when everything's great. The 20s are roaring. Prohibition is giving us the speakeasy, and standards are, depending on who you talk to, is dropping. Well, during that period of prosperity, nobody really in the States really talked a lot about the social teaching. Well, a few people did. And of course, you had, again, the same sort of ethnic and convert Catholic coalition trying to build a Catholic intellectual life in America. So you have the founding of Commonweal. Sheen and Warren come to the United States. You have America becomes, rather than just a Jesuit house magazine, it tries to become an intellectual publication, and on and on and on. You have a lot of these different things. Well, as you know, I guess the Morin Institute should tell you, Peter Morin, who was absolutely saturated in the European aspect of the Church's social teaching, he met a Commonweal reporter by the name of, convert, of course, Dorothy Day. And in turn, between them and with some other people, they founded the Catholic Worker. Meanwhile, there was a Canadian immigrant. See, once again, we're talking about immigrants, ethnics, converts, not your straightforward, regular Catholic American. Nevertheless, this Anglo or Irish Canadian priest, Father Charles Coulombe, was assigned to a parish north of Detroit called in a town called Royal Oak. His church was burned down by the Ku Klux Klan, which was undergoing a revival at that time. So he swore that he would build a church tower so tall that no man could pull it down. And he took to the airwaves. He became the radio priest. And Father Coughlin came out of the same book that Monsignor Ryan did and that the Catholic Worker did, quoting the same material. Well, here's where it gets interesting. In 1933, you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt elected. Now, I have to admit, much as I kind of dislike the man, he is a fascinating character. His great inspiration for the first 3 years of his presidency, although we don't like to say this now, was, believe it or not, Benito Mussolini. Yep, you heard it here first. He was He was the epitome, was Roosevelt, of the 1930s, we'll do whatever it takes attitude and rulership. And a lot of the early New Deal was very much based on not Catholic corporatism, but the kind of corporatism that Mussolini was doing in Italy. Again, we don't like to talk about that. It came a little bit to a screeching halt when the Supreme Court knocked down the National Recovery Act. But if you want something that was American and an obvious imitation of Mussolini, go no further than the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. We do our part. Anyway, I digress. So, what was the attitude of these three people, Monsignor Ryan, Father Coughlin, and the Catholic worker to Roosevelt? Initially, it was very favorable. But early on, people, both Coughlin and the Catholic worker, became disenchanted. Monsignor Ryan, on the other hand, became so close to the administration that they named him the Right Reverend New Dealer, which is kind of a funny name. Meanwhile, Father Coughlin, as the 30s went on, as Roosevelt, who had come in promising that we would never get into another war in Europe, as events marched along in Europe, it became obvious that he did indeed want to get into war in Europe. And as is an unfortunate reality of human nature, you tend to do the opposite of what someone you oppose does, even if doing the opposite is crazy. You see this today with young people. They're told in school that if you're in favor of the family and all that kind of thing, you're a fascist. Well, if you don't know much about much, okay, I'm a fascist. I believe in the family. There, that's a very problematic human trait, but it just transcends time and space. It's everywhere in human history. Anyway, so what happens next? Well, we have the Spanish Civil War, of course, 1936, and this is a watershed moment. In my own family, it marked the time that my grandfather, who used to write for them, broke with Commonweal, because he supported Franco and Commonweal did not. And this was a very divisive thing in the Catholic community. And not just the Catholic community. Tolkien was very much for Franco, C.S. Lewis very much against him. And that led to an interesting dynamic wherein eventually Tolkien complained that Lewis was upset over any persecution of Protestants by Hitler, but apparently thought that Catholics deserved whatever they got from the Reds in Spain. So he made the mistake of introducing him to a man named Roy Campbell, who was a South African poet, also of Ulster Scot descent like Lewis. He had fought for Franco in Spain, and so he and Lewis got into a real Donnybrook, both being Ulster Scots. Anyway, moving along, what happens then is that the Catholic worker, in the meantime, had begun to cultivate, and this is an important distinction that people don't realize. The worker is often dismissed as pacifist. It's not true, not precisely. A little more nuanced than that, as they say in academia. What it was that Peter Morin and Dorothy Day had come to the conclusion that modern warfare, because of its effects on civilians, on innocents, due to technology, the bombing and all that it was impossible to have a just war as the church sees it in the conditions of modern technological warfare. That may seem like a distinction without a difference, but it's not. It actually is a very important difference. However, the worker wanted us to stay out of war. Father Coughlin wanted us to stay out of war. Monsignor Ryan was backing up whatever the administration said. Election of 1936, Father Coughlin broke definitively with Roosevelt and supported a third party, which didn't go very far. I think at that time, the Worker probably was neutral in that election, but I wouldn't swear to it, so don't hold me to it. I leave that to the Munger Institute, who I presume will know better than I do. I hope. Then, what happens after? Well, let's just say that the three sides become more committed to their various non-Catholic allies than to each other. And herein lies, having brought us up to the edge of World War II, herein lies a horribly lost opportunity. You see, during the Depression, because the American system, it was as close to broke as it ever had been, save the Second Civil War. It was a time of tremendous intellectual and political and cultural creativity, oddly enough, as times like that often are. Had the Catholics of America spoken with a united voice, had Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, Father Coughlin, and Monsignor Ryan and the bishops spoken as a united, independent voice, I think the history of the United States would have been quite different. One hopes better, but certainly different. I'll just add also that these distinctions were not always that clear. And Peter Morin in particular, who, frankly, Dorothy Day is the one who's up for beatification. But, or is she already beatified now? Not yet. I don't think. No. But in a lot of ways, I find Peter Morin the really fascinating one. And he would say things that would get a lot of the Catholic workers upset. If you read his easy essays, which you must have done, I'm a man of the right because I don't want to be left behind. And he would upset them by quoting Father Coughlin. And he would say, well, when he tells the truth, he tells the truth. What do you want? Now, contrary-wise, decades later, Dorothy herself would go through the same experiences with the Berrigan brothers, but that's a whole other story.
Well, and to take it a half step back, how do you think American history could have been different if Catholics had spoken with one voice and been united?
Well, for one thing, I think that what was good in the New Deal, and I could take the cheap and easy way out as a professional writer and say that the Federal Writers Project was the only really good part because somebody like me would have had a job. I could say that, but I won't. But the truth is, the whole milieu, number one, could have been much more humane. One of the things about the New Deal as it worked out was it wasted a lot of money, and it was very ideological. There were parts of it that weren't, and those are the best parts. If there could have been more of that and less, covert or overt communism, it would have been a good thing, ultimately, for the intellectual life of the country. Because you see, so a large part of why we are where we are in the United States today is because for several generations, academia, standard academia, has been corrupt, has been Marxist. A large part of that, oddly enough, stems from the New Deal. Now, I don't mean to say that Roosevelt was a communist, but he had an awful lot of them in his employ, and they were in very important positions. Had Catholics played that role at that time, which they could have done having a united voice, again, I think we would be in a much more sensible position now. The one problem with that, of course, is that we would have somehow had to have gained a commitment to evangelization, and that we just didn't have as a body. That's something that our convert and ethnic elements would have had to have restored. The rest of us couldn't.
Would you say that the mistake that all these different parties made, including Peter Morin and Dorothy Day, is that they got swept up in ideology? That ideology overtook their, uh, I guess their like focus from Catholicism into politics? Is that where the mistake is made fundamentally?
I would say the problem is looking for the easy shortcut. If we ally with these people, whoever they are, but they're not Catholic, whatever they are, if we ally with them, we'll get at least part of what we want across. And you see that pattern over and over again, and it never works. So I would agree. I think it was a lack of patience, a lack of a willingness to look at politics in a different way, not as Americans normally look at them. I mean, bear in mind that on a very deep level, we Americans are, even today, are very much into the notion of the common good simply being the greatest good for the greatest number, as opposed to what it was traditionally. And this, incidentally, is what separates even Quadragesimo Anno and Rerum Novarum from a lot of what we say. The common good does not just include economic well-being or political and military security, although those are elements of it. The common good is actually the salvation of souls. Now, the reason why the church pays attention to things like security and economics is because if you're starving or in fear of your life, you're probably not thinking that much about saving your soul. And that was the whole point, you see, of the Catholic confessional state as it was developed in the Middle Ages, as it was seen in the 19th century. Now, the problem with all of that in America, in the here and now, is that you could only do something like that in a country that was overwhelmingly Catholic. And we'd already given up on the evangelization idea. So that put us in this weird state of having to make do with a minority status that we internalized and accepted. We will always play by their rules. I mean, it would be as though Constantine, rather than using his position to try to advance the faith in Rome and culminating with Theodosius the Great, 380, if he'd said, well, we're here, we just want our place at the table. We don't want more than that. We don't want Rome to become Catholic. We accept the Vestal Virgins on their own terms. That basically is what we ended up doing. And the problem with that is that we committed ourselves to a liberal order that was ultimately doomed and was on very shaky grounds at the beginning. You see, and this too takes a little bit of historical thought, but go back before the American Revolution. You have 13 little colonies that are not only very different from each other, they're different internally. In religion, ethnicity, social class, very, very different. What binds each colony together within itself and all 13 together? Two things. That shared moral consensus I spoke of, and the image of the king as the unifier and the protector. All right, we have the revolution. The king's gone. What do? What they did to replace the image of the king, but it was just as firmly based on that moral consensus, was create a sort of civic religion of the country, a sort of worship of America that everyone could join in on, regardless of their faith or lack of it. And there were unspoken truths in it. The Constitution, for instance, was brought by the Holy Ghost. And in our sort of Calvinized, secularized Calvinism, we were the children of Israel, the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind. And even in my childhood, people would say, the United States aren't a country. The United States are an idea. No, it is a country. a country with a history, some of it good, some of it bad, but above all, our country. And that religion of the country, it did act as the animating principle that kept the thing moving until the 1960s. And that's when the moral consensus broke down. And with that gone, the civil religion sort of was a ghost floating in the air. And then had a kind of flip. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in New England in the early 19th century, the Calvinists split. And from Calvinism came Unitarianism, which was the radical renunciation of everything that the Calvinists had been about. Well, in the same manner, from the American religion of which I've spoken, you have this wokery. Instead of being the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind, we were the worst nation ever that was, born in genocide and built in slavery. Well, no. In my humble opinion, neither of those are true. The United States are the country that we were born in or we came to, and that's all it needs to be. Patriotism, as St. Thomas tells us, is a religious virtue. But how does the Catholic in the non-Catholic country show his patriotism concretely? How does he show his love of country? Well, apart from the obvious, fighting in its wars and paying its taxes, evangelizing. That was why, as early as the 200s, you had people like, I think, Tertullian and St. Justin Martyr addressing the emperors and telling them, you don't understand it, you don't realize it, but you have no loyaler subjects than us. We pray for you. We die for you. We are your most loyal subjects, and in return, you persecute us. Some things are perennial in Catholic history. So, I hope that answers it. Does it?
Yeah, that leads me to, so I have a twofold question. So you said the kind of straightforward, normal American Catholics in the lead up to all this, they weren't as interested in the evangelization and all the intellectual ferment as the immigrants and the converts. Why would you say that is the case?
Well, there were a number of reasons. One was the hierarchy for the time of John Carroll was not, with a few interesting exceptions, had never been interested in evangelization. That was part of the deal, you might say. On the other hand, remember that we were mostly immigrants, and we had come over in coffin ships, things like that. We come to this country, or that country, I should say, since I'm over here. We come to the United States for usually economic reasons. We arrive generally in grinding poverty, and we try to make a living and survive. And a lot of us lose the faith in that process. Thankfully, a lot won't, but a lot will. So the combination of a hierarchy that was committed to conformity and a rank and file that was just trying to stay alive.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that Catholics aren't evangelizers? That if we were to be evangelizers, that would be some sort of innovation born of the American situation. I mean, evangelization just wasn't a thing in Europe, right? Like throughout the Middle Ages. But that concept is fundamentally Protestant, it seems to me.
Au contraire. Okay. The truth is that as soon as new lands were discovered, and now I'm not even talking about the voyage to the New World, I'm talking about China, India. The popes in particular would push the religious orders to send missionaries. And the whole reason for the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal was the evangelization of the globe. The oldest parts of the United States were evangelized by Catholics, and they were evangelized. Part of the reason for this, of course, is that when the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French would go overseas, it was very, very hard to get Portuguese, Spaniards, or Frenchmen to leave their homelands. They were very nice places to live, unlike England in the same period, which is why you could get tons of people to cross from England. So what do? Well, one of the things you do is you evangelize the natives and you teach them civilization, and voila, you have more countrymen.
Okay. I was thinking of what we call evangelization, which is lay people going out on the streets and haranguing people about their faith. But if we're talking about the religious orders converting people, yeah, I can see that.
Well, I mean, that was how it was done. The Benedictines, of course, which we don't think of as a missionary order, but they certainly were in the early history of Europe. And if you look at how evangelization was done, its methods, they didn't really vary that much from one century to the next. I mean, there were specifics that were different, but generally speaking, it was the same thing. In our country, the religious orders were never, with very few exceptions. You had things like the Catholic Extension Society, and figures like Father Michael Mueller, Father Arnold Damon, who did try to evangelize. But by and large, it was a live and let live situation. The problem is that, of its nature, Catholicism can't really tolerate that. And when Hilary Belloc came to the United States in the 1920s, he made a very, I think, cogent remark, which was, America's Catholics will either convert their country or be converted by it. Guess which happened?
Well, and that kind of leads to the second part of what I wanted to ask about evangelization is, do you think as part of it, it was so much of a spiritual task to imagine what it would take to convert the New Deal revolutionizing America? And also, like, do you think there was such a sense of urgency and pressure that whatever Catholics might want to convert people, there was the sense that, like, we don't have time, we need some immediate ideological, political answer?
Yeah, I'd agree with both of those. I'm sure that's exactly how they saw it. You know, this is an emergency situation. Everything's falling apart around our heads. We don't have the time. And you saw the same thing in Europe, in the way that Catholics in particular and the traditional European conservatives dealt with fascism. Some of them, at least initially, saw it as kind of a get-there-quick scheme. A lot of them, when they found out it wasn't, but had very different roots and interests, joined the resistance. But ultimately, whichever you chose, you end up wrecked. If you stuck with the fascists or the National Socialists, then you shared in their destruction. If you fought in the resistance, then you were rendered irrelevant by the Soviet-American occupation, and then latterly by the 60s. So, Hobson's choice.
And then, so if we zoom out, we've been focusing on, interwar America, but would you agree that in general, if this is the microcosm, this drama of divided Catholics, this was happening in Europe at the time? Yes. And to some extent, hasn't this been the story of, like, all the counter-revolution since, I don't know, the Glorious Revolution, 1688?
Sure.
This fraught situation where the option is choose the very slow, delicate work of rebuilding society kind of from the ground up, evangelizing your neighbor, versus what if we just make a pact with some faction in society to get back on top?
Yeah.
What would you say to all that?
I would agree. I mean, and it's a temptation, especially if you've been in the fight for a long, long time. It's a temptation that is hard to fight. And, in some sense, the church hierarchy succumbed to the same thing at the time of Vatican II. And by that I mean, from 1815 all the way through to the time of the council, the church had fought a running gun battle with various liberal regimes and always lost. Almost always. Some have little victories, but generally she lost. Well, you get tired of that. It gets problematic. And then, after World War II, you have the United States, which in a certain sense epitomized everything that Blessed Pius IX condemned in the Syllabus of Errors. It emerges as the country it's not a confessional state. It is, to quote Pope Benedict XVI, a confessionally neutral state, nevertheless illuminated by gospel values. Now that sounds ridiculous today, but if you think about what 1965 was like, not so. 20 years before, we had saved Europe from the great dictators, and we were maintaining half of it against communism. The church in America was the wealthiest in the world. Bishop Sheen was on TV and very popular. We had elected a Catholic president. I mean, what's not to like? But for a lot of the hierarchy after the council, this was seen to be the better way to go than to try to restore what had been lost. And again, I'm thinking of Benedict XVI's speech to the German Parliament, in which he talks about how both the American experience and the experience of Christian democracy in Europe after the war proved that the church could coexist fruitfully with modern liberalism. Well, with 2020 hindsight, we can see that the notion that Anglo-American liberalism and continental liberalism are somehow different, not just in degree, but in kind, was specious. But we have 2020 hindsight. We've lived through COVID. We've lived through state-mandated abortion. We've even lived through whole Episcopal conferences dissenting from Humanae Vitae. So when we look back at these things, there's a tendency to think, oh, how naive and ridiculous. But that's because we see where all of it ended up. It didn't look that way 60 years ago. It looked very different. I mean, I remember in my own boyhood, abortion was considered a horrendous crime by the vast majority of people. And when you saw abortionists on television, in TV shows of any kind, as fictional characters, they were always depicted as these horrible, disgusting people. You get a bit of that even in the movie Alfie with Michael Caine, who's still with us. Well, guess what? Our masters clipped their fingers, and we obeyed. It took time, a couple of decades. But we were re-educated, doubtless for our own good. And in the United States, Roe v. Wade provided a convenient umbrella for the fact that in the ensuing 50 years, the vast majority of Americans would come to think abortion, infanticide, was a sacred right. Which is why most pro-life measures that have been adopted since the fall of Roe v. Wade have been put in by state legislatures or by governors. Almost all of them have failed at the polls. What we don't want to live with, what we don't want to face, is the fact that we've become deeply corrupted as a people. That's a horrible thing for me to say. It's not something I enjoy saying, but it's true. And the only way you can get back from that is evangelization. You can't change people's hearts through congressional fiat. Arguably our most pro-life president in my lifetime, President Reagan, as governor, was the man who introduced abortion to California. I remember it very well. And that was before Roe v. Wade. We are sick unto death, to steal a certain Danish phrase. And we have to admit that.
Well, yeah. Some people would argue that the church has been adapting ever since it was instituted, to whatever the conditions are, even in those other countries where, it went to evangelize. It always adopted a certain amount of the culture of those places. And that perhaps it wouldn't be here today if it didn't compromise and adapt with the situation at the time. So, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that would be sort of like the counter perspective to what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So what would you say to that?
What I would say to that is that there have always been adaptations in accidens, never in essence. There are we finally got a couple of Latin academic phrases in there. That is to say that the adaptations the church has made have never affected the integral message. They have not deviated from the gospel. They have not broken doctrine. They have inevitably been ways to make things clearer to people of a given culture. And sometimes, being prudential judgments, the church doesn't get it right, which is why the Chinese rites, for instance, were condemned in the 1700s, and then Pius XI found them to be perfectly fine in the 1920s. Well, none of them dealt with questions of dogma. None of them dealt with questions of morality. They all had to do with everyday practices. Our Lady of Guadalupe is very different from Notre Dame du Cap, but it's still the Virgin Mary. And for all the apparent differences, if you go to those two different shrines, if you know what you're looking at, you can see the similarities. And people also tend to exaggerate the degree to which the church has adapted. If it had adapted all that much, there would never be martyrs. And yet every generation produces them somehow.
Can we bring in your interest in monarchism? That if there ever was going to be some sort of regeneration, whether we're talking about in America or Europe or, wherever this could happen, do you think that we'd have to have at some point like inspiring leaders come on the scene to like lift us up? Or would we have to be the kind of subjects worthy for a monarch to come along in the first place? That's not the abstract question.
No, it's a fair one. And I would say either or both, actually. Again, given what happens in history. I mentioned Blessed Karl of Austria before. He was a great leader, and he was betrayed on every side by his governments, by a lot of his subjects. And he was the best thing that ever happened to them. And they never realized it until it was too late. Then they did. Buyer's remorse, as you might say. I think it's a combination of things. Remember that Christendom, as we think of it, from, say, 380 to 1518, it was not uniform and it was not monolithic. And it developed organically. Nobody sat around and said, let's do this. What happened was the various non-Catholic peoples, the empire on the one hand, the decaying classical civilization, and on the other hand, Germans, Slavs, Celts, all these very vigorous and sometimes unruly people, they all converted. And the faith wrought an amazing change on what those peoples already had and brought those things together. So it took Greek philosophy, Roman law, and the barbarian vigor and transformed them into the institutions of Christendom. Out of the savage Germans, we got chivalry. Out of the often nasty Roman law, we got both the common law and the civil law. And of course, Greek philosophy, I don't have to tell you what people like St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas did with that. So, to answer your question, I think sometimes we get ahead of ourselves in thinking, what sort of institution should we build in order to evangelize? I do think it's the other way around, probably. Now, why do I say probably? Because sometimes that leader does arise. Often enough, as with the Roman Empire, the leader appears when the good subjects have done their duty sufficiently to prepare the way for him. And then things change very quickly. I hate to quote Lenin, but he did have a wonderful phrase, which was, there are decades where nothing happens, and weeks where decades happen. And that's very true. I think that if, taking the United States as an example, we Catholics took our faith seriously, really tried to evangelize, and that needn't be street corner evangelization, although I've known people who are actually very good at it. No, we can all do it in our own particular sphere. You put up a statue of the Virgin in your cubicle, people are going to ask about it. You invite your non-Catholic friends to your kid's first communion party, you got to tell them what it's about. You living the faith openly often says a lot more to people than other things. And that's something we need to bear in mind. And we have to, we really, earlier you asked about the quick fix and all that. I think what that does reflect is something we all suffer from, which is a lack of faith, a lack of confidence that if we do our part, God will do his. He may not do it in the way we want him to. He may not do it in the way we expect him to. But as the old saying has it, if we work as though everything depends upon us and pray as though everything depends upon him, we'll get something decent out of it. I wish I had an easy, handy-dandy solution. But not only do I not, I think history shows us there isn't one. When solutions come, they're organic and they're unexpected. When the faith came to the city of Rome, it's interesting that the two classes that first converted almost en masse were the opposite of each other. The slaves and the old pre-imperial nobility. Now you look at that and you say, what? That doesn't make any sense. How come? Well, for the slaves, it's kind of obvious. The faith gave their lives meaning. They weren't just property. They were human beings. They meant something. Their salvation meant something. For the old Roman nobility, who had attempted to maintain what they considered the old Roman virtues against the corruptions after Augustus, it supernaturalized their desire to do that. It gave it a point, an importance, a reality that it hadn't had before. So those two very opposite classes were the first to come into the church, and coming into the church, they mingled as equals, and then set out to evangelize the rest of Rome with success over a couple of centuries. Didn't happen overnight.
Right, and it seems to me that kind of it parallels that even in America, if it was poor immigrants coming in and, intellectual types looking for answers. Whereas, if you're stuck in the humdrum sort of middle class life, it's harder to escape, right?
Yeah, and when you're very poor, you need to escape. If you think about it, and again, just looking at the American context, in our really more grinding slums in days gone by, there were only two real places of beauty available for free: the churches and the libraries. That was it. Everything else was ugly and poor and unpleasant. But we went to a church, we went to a library, which in those days they tried to make as ornate as they could, in a different world. And in a very real sense, you were in a different world. You know, I can say this as a member of the ordinariate, because in a sense now we can claim this as part of our heritage. But in England, during the rise of the Anglo-Catholic movement, late 19th, early 20th centuries, the Anglo-Catholics were not, shall we say, welcome by a lot of bishops in England, Anglican bishops. Yes, I know they weren't valid bishops. I know. Cuccedo. But what they would do is they'd have this new Anglo-Catholic priest ordained. What do they do with him? They don't give him a good parish. They send him into some slum, some dumpy part of the city, and say, "Have a nice day." And they did. They built incredibly beautiful churches, and the whole notion of the slum priest is a fixture in Anglo-Catholic history today. There were a lot of them. The same was certainly true with a lot of Catholic priests in many, many urban areas. One of the horrors today is that so much of that heritage for the past 40 years or longer has just been dumped. Managed decline, it's called in chancery offices. And what's forgotten is that those beautiful churches were built out of the pennies of poor people and the occasional largesse of a foreign king. They weren't given to be dumped in the street or sold to an antique dealer. One of the habits I've tried to cultivate when I go into a church like that, and I see a stained glass window or a statue or a pew or whatever, and it says, please pray for the Oblivion family, who gave it in 1912 or whatever. I say a quick Hail Mary for the Oblivion family. The story of American Catholicism has its horrible side, which I think we've touched on, but a lot of it's also very uplifting. The problem is we don't really know either side of it.
And we don't know either side of it because most of us are just stuck in our little parochial existence. The parameter.
Pretty much. I mean, not that, as they used to say in the old 60s talk shows, "Oh, I'm sorry, was that a plug?" After they just advertised something they were doing. Oh, was that a plug? But that's why I wrote Puritan's Empire. It was the Catholic history of America, which was then intended to be both a history of the United States from a Catholic point of view, alongside a look at how the church developed in, with, and under everything else. I tried to bring the two strands together. How well I succeeded, I leave to the reader to figure out, but that's what I tried anyway.
Well, and what I always find, because I'm a convert in the last 4 years, and when I'm talking with specifically cradle Catholics, usually in their 20s or 30s, I find like I understand the parameters of like the debates and what I've joined way more than they tend to have. They're just kind of taking, well, I just go to this parish and, my family's always done it and we're conservatives or left liberals, whatever the case is, but usually conservatives. And and they're so checked out from just like the intellectual history. It's really shocking to me. But
there's a reason for it. I mean, when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, there was a very conscious effort in the United States amongst the hierarchy, really, most of it, not all of it. There were some honorable exceptions, and not just bishops, but also the universities, to divorce themselves from the Catholic intellectual tradition in order to become more modern, more American. It was in 68 or 69. The heads of the major Catholic universities gathered at a place called Land O'Lakes in, I think, Wisconsin or Minnesota. Anyway, the Land O'Lakes agreement was that the major Catholic universities and colleges in this country would no longer try to pursue a uniquely Catholic vision. They were very explicit about that. I remember when it happened. I remember my dad fuming. Of course, my dad had gone to the University of World War II, where he said the tuition was free. He was a tail gunner against the Japanese, you see, but also a real autodidact and quite a brilliant man. And he said, that's the end of any real Catholic academic activity in the United States. Because why do we have Catholic colleges? Why do we have Catholic education? Because non-Catholic education is inferior. Why is it inferior? Because it doesn't tell the entirety of the truth. And again, these are hard sayings. We don't like to think in this area. But if there really is a God, if he really is triune, if we're really fallen, if the second person of the Trinity really became man to save our souls, if he established a means of escaping the fall, i.e. the church of the sacraments, if that's true, then you cannot prescind from it. You can't pursue the truth as though that weren't true, because it's the whole point. It's the center around which everything else is hung. I mean, what does it matter if Nix Olympica is the biggest volcano in the solar system if I don't know the reality of my own demise? Mind you, don't get me wrong, I'm all for knowing that Nix Olympica is the biggest volcano on the solar system. I'm not against that. But it's a question of priority. So when they chose to divorce themselves from the Catholic intellectual tradition, they were, in a very real sense, it was what you could almost call a treasonous act. Now, of course, in response, you did have, and almost entirely lay-driven, you did, of course, have a network of colleges grow up literally in response to Land O'Lakes. TAC, Christendom, Thomas More. Later on, Steubenville, of course, was around already, but they sort of redid themselves. Ave Maria, and of course the ITI over here where I am. All those schools do their best to pass on the Catholic intellectual tradition, but they are niche schools. They're not Notre Dame. They're not Georgetown. They're not where even today the hierarchy puts its money. They're not Catholic University of America. They're not Loyola Marymount in LA. They're not Loyola in Chicago. And mind you, I'm not saying these are terrible places that should be dynamited. And I'm not saying that they don't have solid Catholic professors among them doing really great work. They all do. But they have given up on the Catholic ethos, and they have given up on the Catholic intellectual tradition as the defining ethos of their institution. And that is why you won't run into many cradle Catholics who have any connection to it. You see, those universities were founded to provide that very connection. Now, if you're going to get rid of your reason for being, your raison d'être, as you would say, why are you? What are you here for? Go away. You're not needed. I remember mutatis mutandis. I remember during COVID, I was locked down with 8 clerics here in Austria. When you've got 8 priests at hand, you don't have to worry about the sacraments. You really don't. But Southern California, where I've spent most of my life, all my favorite parishes had 3 signs on their websites during COVID that, for me, illustrated completely the great divorce that they had. One was, make a perfect act of contrition, as though that was an easy thing. Make a spiritual communion. Donate here. It was the only one of the 3 that was clickable. Now, I looked at that and I thought, what you're really saying is, I don't need you. That's what you're telling me. That's what you're saying. Fortunately, I didn't believe them. But that was the message that came across. And it's a message, one way or the other, that we've been putting out for most of my lifetime.
Which it seems like It's a grim turn of the screw from if the start of your talk with us was Catholics didn't take seriously evangelization, and then the story post Vatican II, but more or less post conciliar, we gave up on evangelizing ourselves or
Pretty
catechizing.
Pretty much. And Benedict XVI pointed this out in an interview with a Jesuit whose name escapes me in 2016. But look up Benedict XVI interview, Jesuit 2016. You'll see it. Where he said that after Vatican II, the vast majority of Catholics became Universalists. And not only did that destroy our evangelistic sense, it removed any reason to remain Catholic. I see no reason to dispute his argument because I lived it. I saw it. I saw it all around me growing up.
What can be done about this in practical sense? Not just the education piece, but the whole thing. Like, what do you recommend? Because it seems like we're at a point when it comes to education. I would agree. I'm Catholic schools have kind of like de-Catholic themselves, but in general, the society's dumbed down. Yep. Education across the board is bad.
Yep.
And the reason for that has to do more with technology and economics and just the general mentality of the country, which never has been very friendly to education.
No.
So they're but I mean, I know that you're a royalist. What I would think you would kind of go back to that, and if so, is that more of like an ideal that you used to kind of move people towards a different view of government, or would you make an actual proposal somehow that we could actually change to that? And at any case, what purpose does that serve? I mean, how would that fix things?
Those are all very excellent questions. So to answer, first and foremost, of course, we have to internalize the faith in ourselves. I'll get to the whole royalist bit. Trust me, I haven't forgotten. We'll get there. But, especially as we've come into this season of Lent, we have to work on our prayer lives. We have to get closer to the Blessed Sacrament, closer to Our Lady. But we also have to know our faith, which we generally don't. I don't know how many Catholics, when I say there are 4 creeds, look at me funny. They know the Apostles, they know the Nicene. They don't know the Athanasian or the Tridentine, which are equally binding on us. Now, if you don't know what you're supposed to believe, how can you start anything? So we have to know our faith. We have to internalize it. It has to be part of who we are completely. And that's an ongoing process, by the way. It's not like I could say, well, I'm not going to do anything until I'm a perfect Catholic. That day, in those terms, that day's never coming for me. Okay? So it's an ongoing process. But I have to start the process if I'm ever going to get anything like success with it. Beyond that, to answer your question about monarchy specifically, I would say that primarily, yes, I look at it as in terms of setting a new ideal first. You can't go anywhere different unless you have some other view, unless you see things differently. My parents, especially my dad, were active in civil rights before Dr. King got into it. And he had an old black friend whose name, I can't think of it, but man, do I remember what he said. I will never forget that. If you do what you did, then you'll get what you got. Well, yeah. So by promoting looking at the way the church taught these things before, the idea that, you convert a country, and once that's done, the church becomes, as it were, the form, and the state, the matter of the local res publica Christiana. It becomes a sort of natural process. But we have to look and see how they thought about it, how they did it, not to slavishly reproduce it, because, I mean, you'd have the Renaissance Fair, which I enjoy, by the way. I don't want to put down the Renaissance Fair, but it's not real life. You first have a different ideal at hand, and then you look at how might we apply some of it to our own situation. I wrote a book, was that a plug, called Star Spangled Crown, which was the closest I've ever come to published fiction. And basically what happens is we acquire a monarchy. Well, my real effort was not to prescribe a monarchy per se. And the events, as I have them unfold in the book, I highly doubt would ever happen. But what I wanted to do was to show partly the monarchical roots of the American system, which we forget about completely. We think we're autogenetic, and we are not. The Catholic roots of the American system. And thirdly, and I touched on this earlier, looking where the seeds of a true patriotism can be planted. Because the shining city on the hill, just like the horror built in genocide, it's not true. What is true is that we have a history in the United States that begins, well, ultimately with 1492, of course, but certainly with 1567 and the founding of St. Augustine. Our founding fathers in America were not actually the gentlemen who wrote the Declaration and the Constitution. Our founding fathers were the houses of Habsburg, Bourbon, and Stuart. They were our founding fathers. They laid our foundations we enjoy today, and don't even realize, don't even recognize. We just take them for granted and figure that it's part of the American way. Well, it's not at all. Even the Pilgrims, who were probably the least monarchical of the early settlers, you read their Mayflower Compact. What do they say? We subjects, in order to advance the honor of our dread sovereign Lord James VI, at first and sixth. That was the founding and the origin of America, and we've done our best to forget it. In that, Americans as a whole are very like Catholic Americans. We're good at forgetting. So what my work has, I think, if I were to give a theme to it, is to try to get us to remember. Because if we remember who we are, we'll be able to become something better. Not perfect. People often ask me, if you think we had a monarchy, things would be perfect. No, I don't. They'll never be perfect this side of the grave. The only kingdom that's perfect is the kingdom of heaven. But they can be better. Or not. You might make the argument that what we've got is as good as we get and exactly what we deserve. That's an argument. It's one I hope isn't true. But, whenever someone is called, by looking at these things, LARPing, I tell them, imagining that anything can be better than what you've already got is LARPing. And that being the case, enjoy what you got. Don't complain. Embrace it. Remember COVID and be grateful when it happens again.
Well, so how about this for one last question?
Sure.
I feel like there's a tendency that part of the bifurcation of currently existing Catholicism is traditionalists trying to remember things and taking bits of the past, and part of that is viewing, let's say, World War II and beyond, leading up to Vatican II, that there's a rupture. And to me, the vibe is something like, let's retrieve Baroque Catholicism, and that's kind of their project. Now that's a bit of a caricature, but I feel like that's how it comes across at like the common level. And then among the still Orthodox Catholics, I found a lot of times they're like excited to read like Maritain or Morin or Day, and they're like, let's get back to the interwar ferment and let's try and like get back in touch with this and do it over again. And I'm like, but it didn't go very well. Like, let's not, why are you trying to like redo Christian social democracy,
Yeah. Oh, that.
Right. Like, it's, I
The
don't you
the
know
whole
about
failure
like
piece.
Paul VI crying when the head of the Italian, the story, like years of blood, all that, like it didn't go well.
No, you mean the whole failure piece.
Right.
That part, yeah.
Right. And granted, history's murky. It's not just a story of like these people, nobody ever gets total power. So it's always kind of murky. Whose fault is it? It's easy to Monday morning quarterback. But I guess here's my point. Do you think, as some sort of traditionalist, right, that there's something to be taken from that the optimism leading up to Vatican II that subsequently seemed to end in failure? What do you think is there to retrieve?
Well,
Remember.
I think firstly, my confessor in high school and one of my major mentors was the late lamented James Francis Cardinal McIntyre, who was a trad and was certainly a traditionalist at Vatican II. Dorothy Day was a great friend of his. Now this is kind of an interesting thing, except Dorothy herself was a lot more trad than people realize. And there's the famous story of, and I'm sure you've heard it, of one of the Berrigan brothers offering Mass to the Catholic worker using a styrofoam cup instead of a chalice. And when the Mass was over, she grabbed it, ran out into the yard and buried it, and then said to him, "Don't you ever do that again." Well, she really believed. But Cardinal McIntyre said to me, to this day, I knew her for many, 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 many years, and to this day, I can't tell you if she's a saint or crazy. And that he liked her very much, but he couldn't decide. What I would say is that we have to go back to what it is we're supposed to be doing. We're not a society for the preservation of the 1950s. We're not a society for the preservation of 1941. I mean, those are both fascinating eras, but they should be seen as part of the whole context. And I mean, I'll give you an example. There's an old saying, speaking of how to pray, dogmas come first, not liturgies. And don't get me wrong, I am definitely a traditionalist. I'm also a member of the Ordinariate. I have very definite liturgical preferences, which I think are extremely important. But they are not the Catholic faith. My preferences, I mean. I go back to those 4 creeds. If you can read them without blenching and accept them at face value, then you're a Catholic. All right, beyond that, we may have differences, etc. But that's the first thing. That having been established, there are trads and trads. In the 50s, Pius XII was very much aware that there was something desperately wrong in the church. Couldn't quite put his finger on it. He wrote Humani Generis to address the doctrinal issues, which nobody reads. He wrote Mediator Dei to address liturgical issues, which nobody reads. And then he appointed to head the liturgical praxis a man named Annibale Bonini, who in his first act was giving us the new rites of Holy Week. Well, that was they were brought in. They became part of the store of the late 50s, the early 60s. Then, of course, you have the new Mass. Well, when that happened, you had the traditionalist movement arise gradually and then in large numbers, and of course, especially with 1988 and then with Summorum Pontificum. But an interesting thing happened during that period, and that was the rise of the so-called Restore the 54 movement. Now, why was that important? It was important because it was lay-driven. For a long time, for instance, the SSPX, who were strictly committed to the 1962 missile, they would have nothing to do with that. No, it's 1962 alone. No. But why did this happen? Well, I'll tell you why. I've been to both the 55 rights and the pre-55 rights, and the one just really illustrates the truths of Holy Week better, in my humble estimation, than the other. And you got to remember, the faith is not strictly intellectual propositions. But that's why when people get exposed to the pre-54 rights, they tend to get very attracted to them. I'm not pushing this as a simply Restore the 54 ad. Not my point. My point is it's lay-driven. And more than that, it arose during a period of, shall we say, liturgical tolerance. I believe that a lot of our problems in the church today would be mitigated. They wouldn't vanish. They never do. It would be mitigated if we tried to regain St. Vincent of Lerins' saying, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. I think the liturgical issues would resolve themselves if people were given the space to resolve them. That's why when Pope Francis came out with Traditionis Custodes, it was a complete contradiction of the rationale behind Populorum, or behind Summorum Pontificum. He put you in the position of having to choose between him and Benedict. They can't both be telling the truth. So, who is? That should never be done to the Catholic people. The hierarchy have no right to do that. Not the Pope, not the bishops, not the priests. And one says, well, obedience is a virtue. It depends on what you're obeying. When John the 22nd denied that the just will see God until the general judgment, and threw people in prison for disagreeing with him, you couldn't obey him. Obedience was not a virtue then. Unfortunately, these sorts of cases of conscience, when you're in a church that is by its nature hierarchical, we shouldn't even have to worry about them, if you get my point. It's like one of the things that would drive me a little crazy when they had the old translation of the new Mass, and the words say that the chalice is offered for for all. Well, that was a mistranslation of the Latin. A lot of people got bent out of shape and said it invalidates the Mass. I never thought that, because I knew all too well that in prisons, the priests would get away with saying, this is my body, this is the cup of my blood. And that was the essential form of the Mass. Boom, you're done. But it got people bent out of shape, and I'd hear these long discussions. And my response was always the same. We shouldn't have to have this conversation. We should not have this forced on us. The hierarchy have an obligation to the laity as much as the laity do to the hierarchy. And we have to regain that sense that we are all Catholics together. If you accept the four creeds, you're a Catholic. If you don't, you're not. And if you are a Catholic, then you and I are members of the same household. And we better try to exercise charity toward each other. Because there's another unspoken element here. What if you're right and I'm wrong? And through my messing up what you're trying to do, whatever it is, I prevent some good from being accomplished. Now, I think I'm right. But if what you're doing is not obviously coupled with sin, who am I to carp at it? Where do I get off? I may not agree with your methodology. I may think it's never going to work. I may think it's just the wrong way to go. But if you're working truly to the best of your ability for the salvation of souls, it's not for me to condemn you. Not at all. And needless to say, I'd kind of like to have the same in return. But human beings being what we are, that's kind of unlikely. Anyway, I hope that helps.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and especially at this early hour. It's quite a Lenten penance.
Yeah, that's what I told myself. No, it's fine. It's all right. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. No, it's okay.
We appreciate it.
Sometimes decades happen in an hour.
Well, that's true. An hour's in a decade. Well, never mind. But no, you're most welcome. Thank you for having me, and I hope it's been of some use. I've enjoyed our chat.